Next up, we have Dr. Cylita Guy. She's a Toronto-based ecologist, data scientist, and science communicator. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto, where she studied bats as carriers of species-jumping viruses known as zoonotic diseases. And it's fair to say she knows more about bats than Batman. If you're local to Toronto, you might recognize Cylita from her 10 years working as a host at the Ontario Science Centre. She has also appeared on TV and radio, had her writing featured in several outlets, including the book Fieldwork Fail, The Messy Side of Science, and started a children's community science program in Toronto's High Park. In exciting news, Dr. Guy is currently working on her first children's book for Annick Press, Adventures of Your Friendly Neighborhood Urban Ecologists, while trying to figure out how to balance industry, academia, and science communication. Wow, that is incredible. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Cylita Guy.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. And for our audience members, sorry I'm going videos today. Hopefully my internet holds out for our presentation. Okay, can you guys, hopefully you can see this lovely picture of a bat. So I'm really excited. Much like Jen, Halloween is one of my favorite times of the year because I get to talk about, some of the science behind things that other people may think are spooky, but happen to be one of my favorite animals and kind of one of the animals that I think are the most adorable, and that is bats. Now, adorable may not be a word that you associate with bats, and the reason that I think they're so cute is probably because I spent so much time studying them. So as was mentioned, I did my PhD at the University of Toronto, where I was studying bats as carriers of viruses that they sometimes share with humans, but very rarely get sick from themselves. So, one of these kind of examples of these viruses is the reason that we are all meeting digitally today and not in person, unfortunately. But in addition to using math and computer models to make predictions about where in the world we should be looking for these kind of species-jumping viruses, I also studied bats right here in the city of Toronto to try to understand how their behavior changes when they live in cities. And that kind of information is really important. All right, so I think of bats and I love them. I have a lot of fond memories of catching bats here in the city of Toronto and in other places in Ontario, but a lot of people see bats and they're a little spooked out by them. And part of the reason I think for why people find these animals a little creepy is because there are a lot of myths and misconceptions that exist out there about them. You'll hear sometimes that they're just flying rats with wings. Well, this isn't true. Bats are kind of their own completely different group. Sometimes you'll hear that they get stuck in your hair. Also not true. I've caught, hundreds and hundreds of bats, never had one get stuck in my hair. But a lot of these kind of myths and misconceptions persist about them. And we're going to talk about some of these today. But I think one of the other reasons that bats come up a lot at this time of year at Halloween isn't just because people think they're creepy. It's also because we see them presented in really close association with other Halloween characters like vampires. So I'm a huge fan of Dracula, probably not surprising given how much I love bats. But bats are always portrayed as being in really close association with vampires. So in a lot of movies or books or TV shows, we'll see that vampires have this ability to either control bats, or sometimes vampires will change into bats themselves. And I think this association is kind of interesting. And that's why I think a lot of people, or this myth exists, that all bats kind of want to suck your blood or drink your blood very much like vampires. But this isn't there is some truth to this, like bats drinking blood. I want to introduce you to kind of one of my favorite species of bats, is Modus rotundus, or the common vampire bat. Now, don't need to worry. This species isn't found here in Toronto or even in Canada. Down in South America, the reason that they're called vampire bats is because it's the only thing that is in there, kind of an interesting way to live your life. But don't worry, these animals don't suck blood. Okay. Instead, what they do is they'll wait until a very large, generally large animal or bird is asleep. They'll fly down to the ground, fold up their wings, scurry around along the ground, and then they'll use their super sharp incisors or canine teeth to make a very small cut on whatever animal that they're feeding on. And they have these anticoagulants or things in their saliva that will prevent that cut from healing right away. And that will cause the blood to form a tiny little pool. And then they'll just sit and they'll lick up that blood, very much like a cat licking up milk. You're going to kind of have to take my word for it. Maybe it sounds super disgusting, but it's actually kind of cute to see happening in real life. And so there's kind of some truth to this idea that, some bats feed on blood, but it's only 3 species. And they actually don't kill the animals that they feed on. They take a little bit of blood, enough to have them be full, and then they'll fly off into the night. But I think this association between vampires and vampire bats, or bats in general, is a really interesting one. And, I was kind of curious as to where this association came from, like what came first, the vampire back, and you look at old vampires. We've had vampire legends time. Some of the earliest legends about humans feeding on blood came from the ancient kingdom of Mesopotamia. But the word vampire doesn't actually enter into the English language until 1734. And the word vampire is actually an old Slavic word. And all of these kind of Eastern mythology myths about vampires didn't actually involve a vampire having the ability to control bats or turn into bats. So the word vampire appears in 1734. The first species of vampire bat is described by Western scientists in 1810. So vampire bats actually get their name from these mythological creatures or mythological beings who could suck blood. So I think it's kind of cool that bats get their name from old Eastern European vampire mythology. But this formal link between vampires and vampire bats, it actually doesn't even happen until much later, after 1810. In 1897, when Bram Stoker publishes the novel Dracula. And Dracula is actually the first place in writing and so I just think that's a really kind of cool connection between those two things. Excited about then his bats are super cool. And I basically like to pitch it as the fact that they have superpowers, unlike Batman, who just had a lot of money and a really cool utility belt. But it's true, bats have actual superpowers in that they can do things that no other mammal is able to do. So first off, we'll start with what I think is the kind of coolest trait they have. They have this ability to fly. So bats are like you and I. They're mammals. That means they're warm-blooded. They give birth to live babies who they nurse with blood, and they're fuzzy. They've got fur on their bodies, but they're the only mammals that are capable of powered flight. And flight, to kind of highlight how special flight is as a trait, flight has only evolved 4 times in kind of the history of ever. Bats can fly, birds can fly, insects can fly, and the 4th group was pterosaurs, who are now extinct. Okay. Now, bats fly. They are nocturnal. Most species will come out at night. And I forgot I put this one in here. And the other cool thing about bats, the way that bats fly is their wings are just modified hands. So right now we're looking at a picture of a bat that has been caught in a mist net. That's how we sample them in the wild. You can see that their wings are stretched out here. And what we'll see is those long bones in their wings, those are actually their finger bones. So bats just have super, super long fingers, skin stretched between them, and that's what makes up their wings, which is pretty cool. And because bats come out, a lot of species have developed this kind of extra sense or extra ability to help them navigate or get around their nighttime environments. And this ability is called echolocation. So a lot of species of bats, but not all of them, will send out really high frequency sound waves that they'll use to help them get around in the dark. Frequency sound waves are above the range that human ears can hear, but they'll go into the environment, they'll bounce off of objects, come back to that bat and tell them, that there's a wall over here that I should avoid, but there's a tasty insect right in front of me that I want to eat. And now you'll often hear the phrase as a result, because they use this kind of sound to help them navigate in their environments, you'll hear the phrase blind as a bat, okay? This is not true. It's another one of these kind of myths that exists about bats in society. Bats that echolocate can still see, some not very well, but they can still see. But there are entire groups of bats, like our flying foxes, which I'm showing you here, cannot echolocate, and they rely on big eyes to help them get around in the dark. So some and they rely on their eyesight to get around the dark, and they actually see much better than we humans can in the dark. So if anyone ever says, you're blind as a bat, say that's not true. Bats actually see pretty well. Kind of shout out to bat moms. So all moms in the animal kingdom do a lot of work to raise their babies. Bat moms are particularly special because they've got superhuman strength. So at birth, a bat baby weighs about 20 to 25% of mom's body weight. So to put that in perspective, I am a 150-pound woman. That would be like me giving birth to a 40-pound baby. Okay, your average baby is like 10 pounds. That's actually a little bit heavy. But so imagine like if humans gave birth to 40-pound babies, that's exactly what it's like when a mother bat gives birth. But not only is it like me giving birth to a 40-pound baby, it would be like me pregnant with a 40-pound baby sprinting everywhere full tilt, because that is how expensive flight is. And what's even cooler is that after bat babies are born, sometimes moms have to move them from spot to spot or from roost to roost if there's danger, because they can't fly for the first few weeks of their life. And so for moms to move their babies, they'll actually have those babies grip onto them really tight, and then they'll then fly something that is now more than 25% of their body weight to another safe location. So pretty amazing, pretty incredibly strong animals. The other cool thing about bats is that they live for a very long time. So the general rule, kind of, if you look at organisms or you look at mammals, is that the larger you are, the bigger your lifespan, or the longer your lifespan. So animals like elephants and whales can live to be hundreds of years old, whereas if you look at things like so very small, very short lifespans. Despite being so small, live to be over 30 years old. That's an incredibly long time for an animal this size. And because of that, a lot of scientists think that by studying them, we might kind of unlock some secrets to anti-aging in humans. And because these animals live so long, they are actually able to form these really complex social interactions. And so they have relationships with other individuals that they'll continue to maintain for their entire lives. And they have a complex social structure that is a lot like the social structure of whales or elephants or humans. Now, so far, I've been telling you kind of things that lots of bat species share in common. However, there's a lot of diversity or differences in this group that I want to highlight too. So there are currently over 1,400 living species of bats. And the exciting thing about that number is I say approximately 1,400 because we're still discovering new species to this day. So that number, last I checked, sat at about 14 species. Bats are and they count. That means if I lined up all the warm-blooded fuzzy things on the earth that give birth to live babies, your cats, your dogs, your giraffe, every fourth species would be a different type of bat. That's just how many there are, which is pretty spectacular. And when you start to kind of break this down, break this apart, and look at all that diversity, there's so many species or so many differences between them, and some of them actually look quite funny, right? Like if you look at this slide, we've got a bat down here that has this mohawk. That's our Champlain freetail bat. We're actually not 100% sure why they have this mohawk, which is kind of cool. You also have bats that have these really interesting projections on their nose. We call those the trident or spear nose bats. We think that helps them echolocate better. So there's a huge amount of diversity in this group. And I think one of the ways that this diversity is kind of best exemplified is in all the different sorts of things that bats eat. And so when you look at bat diet is incredibly diverse. There are kind of different species that live their lives in really different ways and eat some pretty cool, pretty different things. So by and large, most species of bats are insect eaters. Okay, but even among those species that eat insects, like all of the species that we have in Canada and most of the species that we have in North America, among those insect eaters, there are kind of some really interesting species like the pallid bat. So the pallid bat can be found in the southwestern United States, and it feeds almost entirely on scorpions, which is a pretty dangerous thing to be having for every meal. But the kind of cool thing is the venom from these scorpions doesn't actually really affect these bats. It doesn't have the same effect that it would have on other mammals like you and I. In addition to our bats that eat insects, we also have lots of species of bats that are carnivorous, so they feed on meat. So here we have a species of bat that has a bird in its mouth. So there are some species that it eats birds. There's another species of bat that's carrying off a rodent, so some eat rodents. There are big bats that will eat smaller species of bats. There are bats that eat frogs. So lots of bats that will feed on kind of anything that is available. But in addition to these insect eaters and these ones that are carnivorous, we also have species that prefer to eat fruit. So they will feed on any type of fruit that they can find. These are the species that live in warmer tropical climates. And we also have several species of bats that feed almost entirely on nectar and pollen. And as we've already talked a little bit about today, when we were talking about vampires, we also have 3 out of only 14, or sorry, only 3 insects to plants to nectar. Bats, they end up doing a lot of really important things for our environment. So the bats who feed on insects, they act as free pest control for our crops, which is pretty cool. It means that we don't have to use as many pests feeding on things like our trees, who tropical. Adults watching today and you happen to enjoy tequila, you pollinate agave, which we use to make tequila. They also pollinate things like dirt and cocoa, which we use to make chocolate. And those bats that feed on seeds, they're really important for dispersing, the bats that feed on fruits are really important for dispersing seeds in our ecosystems, making sure that our forests grow up big and strong. So, even if you find bats a little creepy, even if you like to associate with them with vampires and Halloween, you find them a little bit spooky, that's okay, so long as you realize that, we and our planet needs them. They're super important, and we have to have them around so that we continue to have healthy and functioning ecosystems. And so that's all I'm going to share with you today about bats. But if you have any questions, I am more than happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Cylita, for this presentation. I learned a lot about bats, and I definitely have a greater appreciation for them and their diversity. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah, and again, as Cylita said, please submit your questions if you have any, just in the chat box or through email or Twitter. We can definitely address them right now. For me, I have a question for you. Do you have a favorite type of bat?
Yes, I do. And I'm actually going to jet back a couple of slides because I put it in. If you look down in the lower corner at the white bat with low ears, that is the super cute. This is a Honduran white bat. I just think they're adorable. They're about the size of your palm. They live in South America, and what they actually do is they're a type of tent-making bat. So they'll find these really large trees in the forest, and then they'll along the main kind of seam in the middle of that leaf. so that the leaf folds in half, makes a little tent, and then they'll roost or they'll spend a day up inside that leaf. And so if you're walking through the rainforest and you look up, you see kind of these little things that look like cotton balls hanging out under this little leaf tent that they made for them.
Yeah, I think they're really cute. I think you broke up a little bit near the end there, but I definitely noticed this bat because I always think of bats like the other ones are sort of gray and brownish, but this one's white, so I like super unique. So I think you have selected a great one for your favorite. So we also actually found another article about vampire bats, which I hope you can maybe talk a little bit about. This article says from New York Times that vampire bats self-isolate too. And the caption says, when these mammals are ill, they have fewer interactions with family and friends. A new study suggests it's like us, said one researcher. Do you have any sort of initial thoughts about this article?
Oh, so that's super cool. I actually haven't had a chance to see this article yet, but it doesn't surprise me. Vampire bats have chips. Vampire bats are...
Oh, I think we lost Cylita for a second. Hopefully she will be back. But from what we've read, sort of digging into that article a little bit further down, is sorry, just to find my notes. Yes, they have less energy when they're sick, and so they end up calling out less and grooming each other less, which makes sense whenever like anybody is sick. Me for sure. Like I just don't really want to do anything. I don't really want to talk to anybody. Just sort of like one word answers and questions and stuff like that. So that totally makes sense. Whenever Cylita gets back, perhaps we can come back and ask her more questions. Again, feel free to submit any that you have, and we can talk about them afterwards if you have any.